everybody for coming. Thank you, Professor Sandeep. Just wanted to take one moment to thank both of you. Last 6 years, a lot. And also to Mahavir, who has joined online. He has also been very instrumental in many of my works. So, okay, my thesis is about issues related to how to build trust in large public elections like the Indian elections. And I hope you will appreciate the kinds of intricacies that are involved in such large elections. So if you look at the evolution of voting methods, voting actually dates back to ancient Greeks and Romans. And they had, of course, initially some form of public voting, but they themselves realized at the time that this public voting led to voter intimidation and bribery and those kind of issues. And they had some preliminary form of secret ballot elections. And fast forward to the 18th to 19th century, the paper-based secret ballot elections were the norm. But as we have realized in the pre-EVM era, this kind of paper ballot elections lead to many kinds of ballot stuffing or booth capturing kind of attacks where ballots could be stuffed from the point they were cast to the point they were counted. And therefore, electronic voting machines were sort of violated. Another reason for introducing electronic voting machines was that paper ballots lead to a lot of invalid ballots where voters mark the ballot incorrectly, and that kind of issue doesn't exist with electronic voting machines anymore. But as we have seen for the past 2 decades, questions about the lack of transparency of electronic voting machines are always in the news. And therefore, in 2013, we moved from pure EVM-based voting to EVM plus a VVPAT-based voting. VVPAT is voter verified paper audit trail. So this would record the voters' vote in plain text in a paper trail. And the electronic outcome reported by the EVM could be audited against this trail. But questions about how many audits to do and whether that is statistically sound or not, they are always debatable topics. So overall, many people have written about what an ideal voting system should be, but I think you can characterize all of this into 4 fundamental democratic principles. The first one is that you should prioritize public verifiability over trust on authorities or machines. And this is sometimes called software independence in the voting literature, which means that the correctness of the election outcome should be established without trusting on the software that is running in the voting machines or the backend servers and so on. So it should be publicly verifiable in that sense. There could be verification software which is used to check the election outcome, but that verification software can be made open source and anybody can verify it. It doesn't really you're not really trusting the counting of the machines. Second is freedom of choice. Everybody should be free to cast a vote to whoever they want. And this relates to vote secrecy and coercion resistance properties. And next, everybody should have an equal opportunity to vote. And the voting system design should not systematically exclude a certain social group. And finally, in the case of any disputes or failures, there should be utmost transparency and accountability into the voting process, and any disputes should be completely and most transparently handled. So what we will do is that in this thesis, this is our main focus, and we try to evaluate existing solutions against these democratic principles and suggest novel solutions across all 3 phases of the election. An election has 3 main phases. The voter registration, where voters who are eligible to vote in the election, they register, then they cast their vote, and then their votes are processed by backend and we declare the winners. And we find issues across all these phases. And our main focus is on Indian elections. So some of the things may not easily carry over to other elections, more complicated voting rules and such, but our current focus is in elections. So now I will talk about the vote casting and vote processing phases, and towards the end of the talk, I will focus on the voter registration part. So let me just lay out the land of verifiable voting. There are two main approaches. The first approach is called end-to-end verifiable voting. And in this approach, the high-level idea is that the voter has some kind of vote in their mind. Alice is the candidate they want to vote for. And they interact with a voting front end. And at the end of it, they obtain a voter receipt. This voter receipt is contains their vote in encrypted fashion, so it doesn't leak their vote to anybody. But these encrypted votes are uploaded in a public bulletin board. So these encrypted votes are uploaded to a public bulletin board, and any voter can check whether their encrypted vote is correctly uploaded as they are seeing it in the voter receipt. And now these encrypted votes are processed by some cryptographic backend, which finally produces a tally and gives a proof that the tally is correctly obtained from these encrypted votes. So the guarantees are usually split into two main phases. The first is called cast as intended, which means that whether the encrypted vote is correctly recorded as per the voter's intent. And the second is called counted as cast, which means whether the encrypted votes are correctly counted. So the nice thing is that you get formal guarantees of correctness and secrecy, but the correctness crucially relies on voters, enough number of random voters verifying and reporting any failures. So this may be a problem because voters have to be random. So you can actually launch targeted attacks against some voters that you think are unlikely to do this kind of challenge and reporting. And of course, there's complex cryptography involved, so it is hard to understand by voters and administrators. So you cannot really hope to run real political elections via just cryptographic voting. And E2EV voting has been around for 2 decades now, and no major deployments so far. So the other sort of approach is called risk limiting audits. And in this approach, you basically say that there is no cryptography involved. And what I'm going to do is that the voting front end records the voter's paper vote in plain text in a ballot box. And the electronic vote is also recorded and processed by a backend. But you don't care about that backend. What you have at the end of the day is that the electronic system reports a tally, and you have a bunch of
You got muted.
Hello.
Yeah. Now 2 are open.
How did that happen?
Oh, I did it because this is Rohan Dhana, and I thought
Okay, no, so that's the real.
it should be renamed as ITD. There was some background noise, so I muted it. I didn't know that it was this screen.
Okay, so yeah, so the paper ballots are, of course, they're familiar and accessible, but the problem is
go full screen.
The problem with this is that you are now trusting that the custody chain of paper ballots from the time they're cast to their to when they're counted is completely trusted. And this is a problem, as we have seen in Indian elections. So there's this hybrid approach called dual voting, which combines these two approaches and says that let's have an end-to-end verifiable cryptographic system on the electronic side and a paper-based system here, and we now get the formal guarantees of end-to-end verifiable voting, and we get the familiarity of paper ballots. The problem is that now, are you running 2 parallel elections? And what happens if discrepancies arise between the E2EV tally and the paper tally? And how do you minimize voter errors and sort of deliberately induced discrepancies and false disputes. So we proposed this protocol called open voting, and this is a secure dual voting protocol. And we worked upon both the front end side of things and the back end side of things. So I'll get into the front end, but on the back end side, the focus is on verifiability, but as well as recoverability from failures. So if there are discrepancies, can you gracefully recover from those discrepancies and localize the discrepancies? That was the focus of the backend. So now let me shift to the front-end design. So the voter experience goes as follows. The voter has a ballot, which is shown here at the bottom. This is pre-printed, so all the ballots are pre-printed, and a random subset of them can be audited. And I'll describe what the audit process does. But the ballot contains on the left-hand side sort of the candidate names in permuted order, and each voter gets a different permuted ordering. And the right-hand side contains the corresponding encryptions of the candidates. So, for example, C0 would be an encryption of Carol. And the voter has a ballot marking device at their disposal. And what they do is that, suppose they want to vote for Alice, then they would indicate this W, which is their permuted index, to the ballot marking device. And the ballot marking device simply prints this W, the W that the voter pressed, onto a designated gray area at the top of the ballot. And it is important that the ballot marking device does not really see the rest of the ballot. So it's like a ticket stamping machine where you feed in the ballot and then it just stamps this. And now this ballot is in two halves. So the left half is separated, and this forms the paper vote, because the left half contains the voter's choice as well as the candidate names. So this is the VVPR, and the right-hand side is the voter receipt. It contains the encrypted vote. So the cast as intended guarantees are because of the statistical ballot audits. The ballot audits ensure that encryption C0 is indeed an encryption for Carol and not for somebody else, and so on and so forth. So if you sample randomly enough number of ballots, then you have guarantee that every ballot is correct. The secrecy is because of the random candidate ordering and the encryptions, because in the voter receipt, anybody who gets the voter receipt only sees the permuted index, and that doesn't reveal the voter's vote. And this is a BMD with ballot marking device with partially accessible ballot. And the partial accessibility ensures that the vote is secret from the machine. So I'll just compare with some other approaches to do this. There are famously two factions. One is called hand-marked ballots, and these are PrashantDefenseTalk, HR, these kind of protocols. But as we have seen, they lead to these invalid ballots. And there are some pure DRE solutions. DRE is direct recording electronic. And in these kind of solutions, the voter directly indicates their vote to the machine. And the machine then prints an encryption, so that I showed here, an encryption C of the voter's vote. And now the voter wants to challenge the machine whether the encryption is indeed correct. So there is a choice that the voter makes at that point, either to cast this ballot or to challenge this encryption. If they challenge the encryption, then all the randomnesses of the encryption are opened. And since the machine at the time of printing this receipt doesn't know whether the voter will cast or challenge it, statistically, if a random number of voters do this cast or challenge, the hope is that you will have sort of cast as intended guarantee. But the problem, of course, is that the DRE learns the vote, and the cast or challenge mechanism is sort of a cultural thing that you expect people to challenge the output of the machines, which may lead some targeted attacks on people who look obviously like they are not going to challenge. And there is a tricky dispute resolution, because even though the voter might know that the challenge is that the machine cheated, it is impossible to convince this to a third party. And this means that anybody can come up with fake dispute requests and you would not know how to entertain them. But whereas here, note that the DRE the machine does not learn the vote because the machine only learns the permuted index. And there are no targeted attacks because all the ballots are printed. And there is no dispute resolution either because the problem here was that the machine got to know your plain text vote. So if there was a dispute, you could not resolve that dispute without compromising your vote secrecy. But here, the machine only learns something that is public information. So in case of dispute, the voter can, suppose the machine prints a wrong W. The voter, this W could have been sent on a public channel and anybody can verify that the machine printed a wrong W. So these kind of issues are what we handle in open voting. And finally, there is also first-class support for dual voting, which means that it's not just that we support VVPRs, but VVPRs can be, in case of discrepancies with the electronic outcome, VVPRs carry this identifier, which can be used to localize failures. And not just that, the VVPR does not cannot be linked with the voter receipt, and this is an issue we have to be wary about when introducing VVPRs. So all these issues are taken care of, and we have an extensive comparison with 15 polling booth voting protocols against 14 such requirements. And most of the existing protocols are that satisfy many of the required properties are hand-marked ballots, whereas we focus on this ballot marking device type of design, where the voters actually press a button on a machine. Okay, so now we have content part is sort of over. So at the end of this, the voter gets a voter receipt, and a polling officer then scans this receipt and returns the receipt to the voter and uploads all these things to public bulletin board. Now, how do these encrypted votes get processed? This is typically done by what is called as a verifiable mixnet. And this consists of multiple mix servers. Here I'm showing them by M1 and M2. And they repeatedly permute the ciphertext set. And at the end of it, all the permuted ciphertexts are decrypted. So the guarantee is that if at least one of the mix servers is honest, nobody can learn the association between the input ciphertexts and the output plain texts. And the verifiability of the mixnet, the fact that the decrypted list is indeed the correct decryption, is obtained via zero-knowledge proof of correct decryption. So, yeah. But now, when you are in the dual voting setting, you may have some disputes between the paper records and the electronically decrypted votes, as well as you can have disputes between voter receipts and published encrypted votes. And there could be failures during the mixing time. Now the question is that how do you deal with this situation? And so basically we do this by actually replacing the verifiable mixnet by a traceable mixnet, which gives these additional powers. Maybe I think in the interest of time, I can skip some of these. So one thing I want to point out is that many times, how do you decide how many voters should do the challenge? And the way this is decided is that suppose the winning margin is some F, then you ask the question, suppose all F ballots there are F incorrect recordings here. Then how many votes, how many checkings do I require in order to statistically detect these F failures? So this is given by the hypergeometric distribution. But the problem is that what happens if one of the verifications comes out to be negative and you get a failure? then the entire lot becomes untrustworthy. So this is the question we have to be wary about when you are also interested in recoverability, that now the population size that you consider must be smaller, and you have to do more verifications to have a smaller amount of number of votes becoming untrustworthy because of failure. And then if possible, then resolve disputes. Otherwise, in some cases, you cannot really resolve disputes. For example, here, if the paper vote is different from the decrypted vote, then you don't know whether the error is in the electronic path or in the paper path. So, but at least you can identify which were the corrupting polling booths that contributed to these failures, and then identify an undisputed subtally. So this would allow you to sort of maybe if required, run a localized re-election and not having to do a complete re-election. And this has to be done without compromising any more information than necessary, because a naive solution could be to just leak the individual booth level voting profiles, and that leads to localized coercion of the neighborhoods that are voting in that polling booth. And each polling booth hosts roughly 1,000, 1,200 voters, so this would be a serious attack. So this is what we do. We do this via this primitive called traceable mixnet, and I'll just now describe that. So a traceable mixnet is a verifiable mixnet with added powers of controlled traceability. So you can make some additional trace in and trace out queries, and that lets you answer some additional information that the verifiable mixnet does not allow you to get. So let me just give an example. So the trace out query is one where you take an element from the output list of the mixnet and a set of ciphertext from the input list of the mixnet, and ask the question whether this plain text was encrypted in one of these sets, and reveal nothing more than that. So this gives you sort of proof of provenance. And symmetric to that, you have this tracing query, which asks the question that given a ciphertext in the mixnet input list and a set of plain text in the mixnet output list, does this ciphertext encrypt one of the values in this set without leaking any other information? So this is like a proof of eligibility or proof of membership. And I hope you can see that the traceout query can be used to identify the polling booths responsible for any discrepancies, and trace-in helps you identify sort of voter disputes between voter receipts and encrypted votes. Now, the main challenges here are it has to be publicly verifiable, and the secrecy has to be maintained. No more information beyond the query output should be revealed. And the main challenge is that the mixed servers are distributed. None of them know the association between ciphertext and plain texts, but yet they have to come together and give this proof. So this makes it challenging. And finally, we want batch efficiency. So even if this query is run for multiple such entries against the same set, we want this entire batched query to be efficient, more specifically to be linear in the size of the input list. And this is what we achieve. And I just wanted to spend one slide on secrecy in the presence of queries. So you can imagine that when you enable these trace-in and trace-out queries, with each query you are leaking some information. And this should not let, if you do it arbitrarily, then you can learn everything about the association. So there should be some kind of privacy risk analysis, and we have a preliminary static analysis framework for what kind of information would be revealed from a set of queries. And the traceable mixnet guarantees that no query is answered unless all mixed servers agree to answer it. So you can imagine that the query policy derived from the privacy risk analysis can be fed in to the mixed servers, and if the honest mix server is following that policy correctly, then no more information that violates that policy will be ever revealed.
Quick question, is it a differential tendency analysis?
No, so this basically counts what information. It just counts collects together what items you will now reveal, and with more queries, what more items you will reveal, and then collects all that and gives an aggregate response.
So it's a static analysis. Ideally, we would like to do a dynamic analysis. But, so after all the disputes are discovered, you can run the static analysis to figure out that what is the privacy loss that you're suffering. If that is too high, then you may have to refuse to answer that.
Okay. So very quickly, the two main primitives that we use for enabling these trace-in and trace-out queries. There's a well-established primitive called a zero-knowledge proof of set membership, which, given a commitment, this is a cryptographic object. You can think of it like an encryption. Given a commitment and a set of values phi, you can prove in zero-knowledge whether the commitment gamma commits some value in the set phi without revealing any more information than that. But we introduce another problem called a zero-knowledge proof of reverse set membership, which takes as input a value v and a set of commitments and asks the question whether some commitment in this set commits the value v. So the first one enables trace in, the other one enables trace out. And the main challenge was how to now take these to the distributed prover setting. So these things work for a single prover setting, but we are in the distributed prover setting. How do you make them distributed prover, and how do you make them batch efficient? And this is some comparison with some of the existing work. The main takeaway is that most of the approaches they focus on a single prover setting, and there is the only comparison point for us was this collaborative zk-snark based set membership proofs. These extend zk-snarks in the collaborative setting, and we show that our technique is sort of 86 times faster than these techniques for set membership and 18 times faster for reverse set membership. And the source code is public. Okay, so now so far we have looked at the vote casting and vote processing phases of the election. And in fact, most poll site end-to-end verifiable voting systems, they focus on this. But there's really an elephant in the room, which is the electoral rolls and eligibility verification processes. And this is the process where voters make registration requests to a registration officer who uploads their name, address, that kind of information to an electoral roll. And during polling, a polling officer verifies their eligibility, whether they exist in the electoral roll, and only then allows them to cast their vote. And indeed, there are many possibilities of eligibility frauds. A single voter could be registered multiple times. Ineligible voters could be put up on the electoral roll. I have heard that Indian gods are on electoral rolls. And of course, during polling, ballot stuffing can happen. And eligible voters can also be denied. So you make a request and the officers are just ignoring the request. That can also happen. So what is typically done, at least in the Indian context, this is what is done, is making the electoral roll completely public. So right now, you can download in a PDF everybody who is eligible to vote in an election, their name, address, photograph, gender, all this information. And this information is obviously sensitive, and it leads to a lot of voter profiling manipulation attacks. And there are sophisticated voter profiling software that have been developed. In one report, it's an old Guardian report which says that they track some 400 special characteristics and get an 82% accuracy into whether you would vote for them. You would vote for a party. So, so we want to avoid these threats. And in addition, there is this forced abstention attack, which is possible if it is revealed whether you voted or not. So if that information gets leaked, then somebody can force you to abstain from voting. And if you did not, then they wouldn't. So our contribution was how do we get a publicly auditable yet privacy-preserving electoral rolls and eligibility verification. And the high-level approach is the following: that voters who went to register and voters who went for polling, they should get a receipt. Even if they are denied, they should get some kind of rejection receipt. And this gets fed into an audit protocol. The audit protocol also takes as input all information that is published, which is the electoral roll and the encrypted votes that are published by the underlying end-to-end verifiable system. And finally, it should output whether there were any eligibility frauds or not. So the properties that it should satisfy is that even if all the authorities are corrupted, the audit must fail if there were a large number of spurious votes or voter denials, meaning a large number of eligibility frauds. And for privacy, we want to protect against these voter profiling and forced abstention attacks. But we have to make some assumptions. First is that at least one of the backend servers must be uncorrupted. This is commensurate to the kind of assumptions that are made in the mixnets, as in the end-to-end verifiable backend. And additionally, the edge devices, the registration officers, the polling officers who directly have to deal with identity data in order to verify, they must be trusted. But our main threat is from these external political parties, and we don't want any systematic targeting using information that is published online. So therefore, we trust these parties, and there have to be separate mechanisms for ensuring that they don't leak out your data. And an important requirement for us was that voters must be bare-handed, and they should not be required to carry any secret keys or credentials in order to be eligible to vote. And if they do, if we have that requirement, then it is very easy to sort of disenfranchise voters and steal their credentials and in any way coerce them. So this means that the eligibility checks that we make are necessarily manual. So you are eligible to vote in an election because you are a citizen of this country and because you live in this constituency, not because you hold certain secret key. So this is what we try to aim, a natural notion of eligibility. But since we have these manual checks, it is also important to make sure that the number of such manual checks is much smaller than the size of the electorate. Otherwise, it's infeasible. So the high-level approach. How am I doing on time? Otherwise, I can.
Maybe 5 minutes, huh? No, 10. 5 minutes.
Okay. So at a high level, what happens is that the voter goes into an officer to make a registration request and gives some kind of eligibility data and a proof of presence. This proof of presence is just establishing that I really came. And as a metaphor, you can think of a photograph behind there with the registration desk showing in the background. So the idea is that nobody should be able to forge this proof unless you actually went to register. And this information is sort of encrypted and uploaded to this bulletin board against an identifier, a unique identifier. So this could be a national identifier like Aadhaar. what we need is that this should be deduplicated. So no voter should have two such identifiers. But even if you have such an identity system, you cannot really use it for voting because an identity system like Aadhaar is used in hundreds of other places. So you would really want to create an unlinkable identity from the Aadhaar identity. So therefore, we employ a verifiable mixnet to create these unlinkable voting identities. And then you get this encrypted information next to these unlinkable voting identities. Now, the eligibility officer who is responsible for that jurisdiction can decrypt this encrypted information and indicate whether they think you are eligible for the election or not. Now, finally, when you come to cast your vote, you actually obtain some kind of encrypted vote from an underlying E2EV protocol. And you give this encrypted vote along with another proof of presence to prevent against ballot stuffing kind of attacks. And the polling officer gives this, uploads this information in encrypted form along with these encrypted votes, which are now processed by the backend. And the voter gets a cast receipt. And even here, the voter gets a registration receipt. Now, the idea is that if you statistically audit some rows of some voters, it would not be enough for the kind of sophisticated voter profiling attacks that we were talking about earlier. And we show that with just 2,500 openings in a million voter election, you can get pretty good guarantees. So this gives us both efficiency and privacy friendliness. And the entries that you open, for them you have to do whatever manual check is required to establish voters' eligibility in the real world. So the guarantees are that if more than some alpha receipts were audited, then the probability that there were more than F spurious votes or F voter denials is less than some small epsilon alpha F. And this comes from some kind of hypergeometric distribution. And here's that example, that if you have a million voter election and the winning margin is greater than 2%, so you can imagine that the number of failures are at least 0.02n in order to change the outcome of the election. Then with just 2,500 audits, you can get this probability to be less than 0.0005. But as you audit more and more receipts, then of course your privacy of more and more voters is getting leaked. But what we guarantee is that if less than alpha random entries are audited, then the adversary's advantage in learning a voter's identity or participation information is less than this some delta alpha, and this delta alpha is 0.01. So for here you can so you can think of this as saying that with just 1% voters identity information getting revealed, you can get these soundness guarantees. But we don't want this to discourage voters from sort of getting their receipts audited. So what we guarantee still is that even if a voter's receipt is audited, the adversary cannot link the VID information with the UID information, with the voting identity and the primary national identity. And that advantage is also bound by this point. So now I just come to the summary of contributions. We started with the vote casting phase, and I talked about the robust dual voting front end. And also we've done this extensive analysis of existing protocols. The backend side, we proposed this notion of recoverability in dual voting and gave this recoverable dual voting backend with a traceable mixnet as an independent interest kind of contribution. And finally, during voter registration, we gave a publicly auditable yet private electoral roll protocol. And I'll just point out some limitations. So, of course, extensions to ranked choice voting rules is interesting, and also multi-race elections, where in a single vote casting you are voting for multiple races, not just one race. These kind of elections are popular in the US and other parts of the world. So we can actually support some of these things for when the number of candidates is few. But when the number of candidates is large, then the usability issues and the privacy issues have to be relooked at. The performance of traceable mixed nets, although it is that 86 times faster than existing techniques and 18 times faster than existing techniques, is still, it is fine for voting, but it is in some hours. So it would not be fine for some more general purpose applications of traceable mixed nets. And finally, we do rely on this primary identity system, primary deduplicated identity system. But for really secure electoral rolls, you would want a provable deduplicated identity system. And this is a very hard problem to issue. So with that, I would end my presentation.